Okay, having talked a bit about the domestic cultural situation, let's take a look at the political situation, particularly in international affairs. Now, what I'm going to talk about now bleeds from the 1950s through into the 1960s because it's really all part of one story. This, of course, is Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States from 52 to 60. First thing to remember and recall is that the United States had had a long tradition of isolationism. As we know from the Washington's address up until the Second World War, the United States had this tradition of isolationism, occasionally broken or with this exception made for Latin America and this. With Truman, the Truman Doctrine, the United States really begins to move away from that. The Korean War was a mess. The Korean War was unpopular. Nobody was really happy with what was going on, and so it was one of the things that killed Truman's political career and that brought Dwight Eisenhower in as president in the 52 election. But we have to remember something. Eisenhower was an internationalist, to be contrasted with Robert A. Taft. Robert Taft was the son of the former president and Republican, and what we would class today as a very conservative Republican. He was an ardent opponent of everything that the New Deal stood for under FDR. Believed in smallest government possible, no intervention of the government in economics. He was a very ardent isolationist. He wanted to keep America completely uninvolved in, unentangled, he would say, I guess, in affairs around the world. That was right through the 30s and 40s. Opposed Lend-Lease, opposed all of that stuff up until Pearl Harbor. When Pearl Harbor happened, he was as much a supporter of the American war effort as anybody else, but he wanted the United States to stay out of foreign affairs after the war. So he was not a fan. Even though Taft was conservative and a strong opponent of communism, he was not a fan of the U.S. getting involved in NATO, because he saw NATO as too much of a foreign entanglement. So the 52 election involved, among other things, a strong primary for the Republican nomination between Taft and Eisenhower, and it really split the Republican Party very badly. Eisenhower, the internationalists, who wanted to engage the rest of the world, and Taft, the isolationists. Taft lost and actually died the following year. So, Eisenhower becomes president, and so Eisenhower is then looking at the world of the Cold War. And the Cold War was changing in the sense that it was becoming somewhat worse. As we mentioned, under Truman, eventually the Russians got their hands on an atomic weapon. That rattled the world because, as I said, an important point to remember, and Stephen Ambrose, actually, great historian of this period, who was on Eisenhower's staff, pointed out, the atomic bomb, as I said to you, was not the ultimate weapon. It was viewed as an equalizer. The Russian army was so massive that if they had invaded Europe to take over Western Europe, the atomic bomb would have equalized the forces, not been the decisive factor. Well, now the Russians had an atomic weapon of their own, and then there was the race for the hydrogen bomb, which, as I pointed out to you, is many times more powerful than a standard nuclear weapon, and we were off into the arms race. The Russians got their hands on or built a hydrogen bomb shortly after. You had all kinds of espionage going on. It's worth remembering. I don't know if you did it in global or Euro, but England went through its own spy scandal where some extremely highly placed members of the British intelligence community, these were spies working the equivalent of the CIA in Britain, it turned out were actually all Russian double agents, and they defected to the Soviet Union. So guys like Kim Philby, for instance, you can look him up, Philby, and the companions around him, turns out they've been working for the Russians all along, and some of them wound up in defecting to the Soviet Union. This scared the hell out of the West. The Russians seemed mighty powerful and expanding, and how were we going to contain them? Containment, as I mentioned, George F. Kennan's idea, continued to be the policy right up until the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. So Eisenhower is continuing that as well, but in a world that has more than one nuclear country. He becomes president, takes the oath of office in 53, the 52 election. By 54, so just a year into his presidency, the United States and the Soviet Union both had hydrogen bombs. And you had what Churchill famously called the balance, not the balance of power, but the balance of terror. Later on, it will get another name stuck to it called mutually assured destruction. I don't know if you did that again in Euro or global, but that's the idea of the only thing keeping the world at peace was the notion that if the Russians ever tried to destroy us, we had the ability to completely destroy them at the same time. And that's why you had all of these, race, first of all, to outdo them, so that if they ever tried to launch an attack, we'd have so many weapons that they couldn't possibly get them all, and we'd be able to launch a counterattack. That's the only way mutually assured destruction works. So if the Russians sent all of their bombs at the United States all at once, we would be able to survive enough so that we could destroy their entire country with what we had left. And that would be the only thing that would keep them from launching an attack on us in the first place. That's the kind of... Now, if you just stop and think about that for a minute, what a tension-filled, horrible way to look at the world that is. But that's the theory of how things were going. The United States was obsessed with this. There's a great documentary that was done, you can look online, again I'm sure, called Atomic Cafe, which is just a compilation of a whole ton of films from the 50s, public films, that show you what it was like. Kids in school, every well, depending on where you were, but every so often, the same way we have fire drills, the kids in school had bomb drills, and they were taught to duck and cover. There's a famous school kids film, that was supposed to be shown in schools, and kids learn this jingle to duck and cover, where if warning of the bomb came, you literally got under your desk, covered your head, and then waited for the all clear, as if you could survive a nuclear bomb. Civil defense, CD, was a big deal. The civil defense was the national program, national department, that would, in the event of a nuclear attack, they were the people who were supposed to be in charge of bomb shelters, fallout shelters. We know what fallout is, I assume. When you set off a nuclear weapon, you have the initial blast, and you have the heat, and you have the radiation that comes from it. And then it throws into the atmosphere multi-tons of radioactive dust out of the earth. That floats along, and then it falls out of the atmosphere, and is the radiation there lasts a long time, very dangerous. That's called fallout. So civil defense also had fallout shelters all over the place. Every public building and a lot of private buildings had in their basements shelters where if there were an air raid, you were supposed to head for that, and that would keep you safe. This is the sign that used to be on them, and a lot of these are gone now, but if you still look around on a lot of older public buildings, you may still see these up in different places. Americans were encouraged to build their own nuclear shelters in their backyards and basements. There was a big industry in this. You could buy, you see this sort of tube thing here, you could buy pre-made ones, and you would have a guy dig a hole in your backyard, and you could drop this into it, and then supply it with canned food and canned water and all the stuff that you would need to survive over time. But the government also had handbooks of how to create a fallout shelter in your basement. You didn't have to necessarily build a separate building. You could build a room into your basement that was protected. And, this was popularly promoted. It was a big growth industry in the period. Contractors would come and build it for you. It was a big Boy Scout project, how to build a fallout shelter in your own basement, and Popular Mechanics, which was one of the big magazines at the time, would have plans in it, and this sort of thing. But this is the world people are living in. That people were expecting nuclear war at any minute, and I suppose in part to prevent a sort of national nervous breakdown, this idea was promoted that nuclear war would be survivable. That if we had it, a lot of people would be killed and be very dangerous for a while, but if you plan properly and carefully, you could actually survive a nuclear war. And then the government had all sorts of plans for what was called continuity of government. If we were attacked, how would we keep the postal system continuing to run in a nuclear radiated world? And it sounds nuts, but this is really what people did, and it led to all kinds of discussions. There were essays and books published by Catholic theologians in the 1950s, struggling with the fact of, if you had your family in a fallout shelter and you knew you only had enough supplies to take care of your family for so many weeks until it was going to be clear, and you're locked in there, and the neighbors come and knock on the door and say, please let us in, what do? Do you let them in knowing that you could be killing your own family by doing so, or do you lock them out because you can't save everybody? I mean, these are the kinds of dilemmas people are facing. Okay. This is John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And by the way, his brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the CIA. And we talked about Cardinal Dulles. They're all the same family, by the way. Anyway, John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower came up with the idea that we would threaten the Russians with what was called massive retaliation. That's a word to know. Massive retaliation. The idea of this was that if the communists ever did anything, if the Russians, the Soviet Union ever did anything, instead of sort of fighting these small, limited wars on the edges, if they made a move, we would use nuclear weapons in an attempt to massively wipe them out. So, you know, as is said in the movie The Untouchables, he pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He puts one of yours in the hospital, you put one of his in the morgue. That was the idea behind massive retaliation. If the Russians step over the line, we'll wipe them out. Dulles' justification for this was in a famous quote, "If you are scared to go to the brink," meaning the brink of war, "you are lost. If you're scared to push the Russians right to the edge and threaten to go all the way with them right to the brink of war, you're going to wind up losing." That was his point. His phrase gave birth to the word brinksmanship. Another word to know, brinksmanship. The idea of brinksmanship is it's playing chicken. You know, if you guys know what that is. Chicken also, by the way, was a very popular game in the 1950s. Two idiot teenage guys would get in cars and drive them at each other to create a head-on collision. And the chicken was the guy who flinched first and got scared and turned his car off the road. So theoretically, if they were both brave, they'd wind up dead. But one of them would chicken out, and then they'd both walk away, and the guy who didn't turn was the winner. That was the idea of chicken. And there are idiots who still do it today. But brinksmanship, the only way to think of it is as a sort of international diplomatic version of playing chicken. Soviets threaten, we threaten back. Threat, 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 and hope that one side backs down before we both start throwing all the nuclear weapons we have at each other. What this did was basically raise the level of anxiety all over the place. Americans got more and more fearful and paranoid about the Russians coming over any minute. And the Russians got paranoid about what the Americans might be willing to do. The Russians also ramped up their own rhetoric on their side. The premier of Russia was Nikita Khrushchev. And there's Nikita Khrushchev right there. Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union, and used to really push things. He would tell people that history is on the side of the Soviet Union. He famously showed up at the United Nations once, took his shoe off, banged it on the table to get everybody's attention, and was shouting at the American delegation, "We will bury you, we will bury you." So this was a guy who was kind of ramping things up himself. I should just point out, if you care, the guy over here, that's actually Leonid Brezhnev, who succeeded Khrushchev later and was the leader of the Soviet Union through the 70s. Anyway, this is another example, by the way, of Khrushchev's sort of self-confidence, arrogance. He's standing here at an exhibition that was held in Berlin in '59. It was an American exhibition in which the United States showed off a lot of stuff, particularly consumer goods. It was kind of an industrial exhibition, and so it had things like a typical American kitchen, and there's your SOS soap pads, and there's your washing machine, and all the other consumer goods that they had. And we sent over this guy, who is Richard Nixon, later to be president, Richard Nixon. At the time, he was vice president. He was Eisenhower's vice president. Eisenhower never thought much of Nixon, but Nixon was a well-known, well-liked by the conservatives anti-communist. And so Eisenhower brought him along as vice president because it gave him credibility with the right wing of the Republican Party. Anyway, they sent over Nixon as part of the American delegation, and Nixon and Khrushchev got involved in a thing called the kitchen debate, which you can go look up on YouTube because it was actually filmed for television. The two of them were hanging out. This was supposed to be a friendly event. You know, all during the Cold War, as much as we hated each other, we kept having these sort of shows of friendliness. So they had this American exhibition in Berlin to show off American life. They send Nixon over. Khrushchev comes and he makes a tour of the exhibit. And then the two of them give this kind of joint informal press conference. They're just standing in front of the cameras chit-chatting. And Khrushchev is going on and on about how much better the Soviet Union is. And Nixon, for one time in his life, tries to be nice and diplomatic. And the reporters are there, and he says something about how, well, you know, Mr. Premier, we have so much we can learn from each other. There are many places where the Soviet Union has great advancements, for instance, in the area of rocketry and space exploration. And Khrushchev nods his head as he's listening to the translation. And then there are other areas, Nixon says, where maybe we're a little bit ahead of you, like in consumer goods and things. And Khrushchev sort of explodes and says, no, you're not ahead of us in that either. We're ahead of you in everything. And Nixon, it really made Khrushchev look very self-confident, and it made Nixon look like a bit of an idiot. But this was the kind of self-confidence that the Soviet Union was showing off all through this time. And that really scared us, because a self-confident nation might do something. Which gets us then, of course, to Sputnik. And I think you're already familiar with Sputnik from Global and Euro. That's Sputnik. Sputnik in Russian just means satellite. So Sputnik 1 was just satellite 1. And that's a real Sputnik. I don't know what you've seen of it or how much you've studied it. I kind of find it interesting because, you know, we tend to think of these spacecraft as being these gigantic things. And Sputnik was, I don't know, maybe 2-3 times the size of a basketball. It's really not that big an object. And with these long, you can't see it, but these long antenna whiskers. And Sputnik didn't actually do much. Again, I urge you to go on YouTube, punch it in, look it up, or actually Google up Sputnik audio so you can listen to it. And what you hear is just beeping. As Sputnik went around, it was launched by the Soviet Union. As it went around the Earth, it just beeped. Sent out radio signal beeps. That was useful because the pattern of the beeps could be decoded by the Russians to gauge things like temperature and so on up there. So it was the beginnings of space exploration, the first time we'd ever sent anything into orbit, and so the Russians could learn things about pressure and all that kind of thing. Very, very primitive from modern scientific viewpoints, but it was the first taste anybody had ever had of space. What scared the crap out of everybody was that to make the orbit, it passed over the United States. And as it passed over the United States, anybody could tune in and listen to its beeping. In fact, if you go and you punch in Sputnik audio, what you're going to hear is not an official recording of Sputnik. What you'll hear is recordings that were made by dozens of amateur radio guys, ham radio guys, who would pick it up on their shortwave receivers, and they made recordings. So anybody in the United States with a shortwave radio, and tons of people had them, could listen to this beeping as it went overhead. All right, so what? Well, first of all, it meant that the United States, the great, brainy, ingenious United States, with Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Chicago, that had built the first atomic bomb, was all of a sudden way behind the Russians in science. That was a slap in the face. And second, it meant the Russians could launch something from the Soviet Union on a rocket and it pass over the United States. That meant, in theory, although the technology wasn't quite there yet, but in theory, they could launch a missile from Russia to any place in the United States they wanted to hit. That's what terrified people. There's a little bit of a myth that it shocked the hell out of the Eisenhower administration. It didn't exactly. Eisenhower and the people in government actually knew that Sputnik was coming. It was not a big surprise to them because they had all sorts of secret intelligence. To the average American, though, it did come as a massive surprise. So in 1957, October of 1957, when this happened and news programs, TV programs, announced that the Russians had done this, and the TV announcer could play for people the beeping, it really terrified folks. As you may know, it changed education. In the United States, all of a sudden, the emphasis went crazy for mathematics and science education. We were so terrified and so shocked by this that we were convinced that the Russians were so far advanced scientifically, we had to catch up. And the average American kid, was not Einstein, and so we had to make them all little Einstein geniuses. Otherwise, we'd never be able to compete with them. A lot of that was needless panic. The United States had as many or more brilliant scientists as the Soviet Union. U.S. universities were just as advanced as Russian universities. American kids were no better or worse or certainly no worse educated than Russian kids. But people, again, this was the fear, this was the panic, and so you saw entire school systems suddenly shift their educational programs to emphasize a lot more science and mathematics in school. That's one of the reasons you guys take so much chemistry, physics, and so on, and so much mathematics. Some of that is a holdover from the Sputnik days. It also meant that the United States created NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the purpose of which was to compete with the Russians. Now, there was a double-edged track going on there with space exploration. Never forget that. On the one hand, there was the public face of it. And the public face of it was that this was all about the peaceful uses of space. And so the NASA in 58, after 58, 59, after it was created, after Sputnik and all that, named the first astronauts in the United States, 7 guys, and you started the Gemini program, the Mercury program, which was about putting a man into space. The Sputnik was followed by Sputnik 2, and then the Russians started launching dogs into space. Laika, famously the first dog that went into space. Laika was a stray dog that they found in Moscow, and named Laika, which in Russian means barky, and sent that into space. Then they sent a chimp into space, and the United States wanted to be the first ones to get a man into space. That didn't work out either, because In 1961, the Russians sent this guy, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. He's the first human being ever to be sent into space, and went around the world, made a couple of orbits, and then landed safely. So it was humiliation after humiliation. You know, they got a Sputnik up before we got a satellite up. Then they got a man in space before we did. And so there was this terrible attempt to catch up. But the public face was about this, you know, space exploration, civilian use of space. Even when in the 60s, when Kennedy wanted to put a man on the moon, it was about the peaceful exploration of the moon. But the other side of it was that we were terrified because if they could put a satellite or a guy in space, it meant they could also put a weapon in space. And so sort of the subtext to all of this, the behind the obvious to all this, was the Defense Department's involvement. And from the beginning, the Air Force was involved in the space program on the presumption that space would at some point become militarized or be able to be used as a weapon. That's why, for instance, when they changed, as I told you, there was just revolution education that came along. It was funded by the federal government not just as an educational thing, but as the National Defense Education Act. So when the feds gave the money for everybody to start shifting to a much more math and science-oriented curriculum, it wasn't just done because democracy has to compete with communism or our kids should be exploring space too. It was a threat to national security. Yeah, that was the thing. So, so this was the atmosphere of the Cold War. Now, there's a lot, obviously, that goes on in the Cold War. Sputnik and the domestic fears, terribly important. But I want to move on and sort of continue this thread past Eisenhower into the 1960s. Okay. Before I go into the transition to Kennedy, I just want to mention a thing, because I guess this is the best place to mention it. A phrase that comes up a lot in the 1960s in the countercultural movement is military-industrial complex, the military-industrial complex. They're seen as one of the big enemies of the country by the hippies and the peace movement. I just want to mention it to you because it has an interesting origin. By military-industrial complex, what they mean is the relationship of business to the military. Big business, as they say, likes war and likes a big army. Why? Because it gives them the opportunity to sell stuff to the government. The military likes war because it gives them something to do. It gives all of those officers in the military a way to get medals and get promoted and advance their careers. And guys in the military tend to have a very aggressive attitude. So let's get those Ruskies wherever they are. Let's go after them, even if we're doing it through proxy wars and on the edges. And so there was this thing in the 60s where people said, you know, the big business that sort of depends on lots of government money for defense contracts and the big military are in a conspiracy with each other to keep ramping up America's military spending. Yeah, the big businesses scare the hell out of Americans and convince them they have to go to war, and the military tells Americans they need to buy all of this equipment in order to do it. Well, the guy who invented that phrase, military-industrial complex, was none other than Dwight Eisenhower. As president, one of his very last press conferences, he warned Americans to be careful of the military-industrial complex. Now, Eisenhower was an old military guy himself, and certainly wanted international involvement. As I pointed out to you, he was the internationalist against Taft. That's not surprising. Don't forget what his job during the Second World War was. He was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. He didn't view the war from the perspective of Washington. He sat in London, in England, where he had Winston Churchill sitting on one side of him, and he had Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, and he had what was left of the Belgian army, and what was left of the Dutch army, and what was left of the Polish army, and he had to work with Stalin. He was a guy who had had a lot of experience in international affairs and a strong anti-communist himself. But he's saying to Americans, you have to be careful, because the business guys are going to try to make the most they can out of America's need for defense, and the Army has a sort of natural bias toward expansion of itself. It's interesting he comes up with that phrase. Anyway, by 1959, Eisenhower's not going to run for re-election. He's had his 2 terms. His vice president, Nixon, decides to run. Nixon was beloved by the right-wing Republicans and certainly had strong credentials as an anti-communist. And he comes up against Kennedy. Kennedy was also had very strong anti-communist credentials. As a senator in the 1950s, he had been an ardent and outspoken anti-communist. He was a Catholic, and the Catholic Church was the most vocal and powerful international body fighting communism. Communism was specifically condemned because communism was aggressively atheist, particularly at this time. The Russians routinely rounded up Catholic priests. There were some in Russia. Depending on the time period, Russian Orthodox priests as well, and treated them terribly. They oppressed the Catholic Church in the Ukraine, where there were a significant number of Catholics. Catholics in Hungary, Cardinal Mindszenty, who was the senior bishop in Hungary, was lived really in a American embassy over there in a kind of exile / imprisonment for years. Cardinal Stepanak in Yugoslavia. The communists really had been at war with the Catholic Church, and so Kennedy, as a Catholic, had good, strong credentials as an anti-communist. When they went up against each other, and we'll talk about that election separately, Kennedy won, and in part on his anti-communist credentials. So how does that fit in with this Cold War stuff? Well, once Kennedy is elected, one of the first crises he has to deal with is Cuba. Cuba had been run by this guy, Fulgencio Batista, who was a military, oppressive, and startlingly corrupt leader of Cuba. So there had been a series of Cuban revolutionary movements, the most important of which was led by Fidel Castro. Castro actually came from a very privileged background. His family, he came from wealth and good education, but he was fighting for what he perceived to be workers' rights in Cuba, and launched a revolution, and by 1959 had defeated Batista, taken over the country, and he then imposes and this is very complicated. If we had a whole semester to do Cuban history, I'd get into the complications, so I'm giving you very shorthand. He imposes what amounts to a personal communist dictatorship. It's a kind of cult of personality of Fidel Castro. It is nominally communist, and it is a dictatorship he has over the country. The United States had actually supported Castro for a while because a lot of people thought that he was going to establish a democracy and a Western democracy in Cuba. And when he he turns into a communist dictatorship, there were a lot of people who felt betrayed by this. He immediately establishes close ties with the Soviet Union, and this creates a crisis in the Cold War, because here you have a communist dictatorship, not in Europe, not in Turkey, not in the Far West, but just off the coast of the United States. There's Key West, right, off the southern tip of Florida, and as you see, it's just barely over 100 miles from Havana. 100 miles, nothing, you know. I mean, that's a 100-mile radius map from Hill. So, you know, you're talking about something that's a 2 or 3 hour drive if you were able to drive it. So the presence of a communist government and a Soviet-friendly one that close to the United States, forget about the Truman Doctrine. That violates the Monroe Doctrine all the way back to Monroe, that foreign governments shouldn't have colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Remember that? And it seemed like a direct threat to America. Kennedy, therefore, is under pressure to respond, and there are all sorts of secret plans for getting rid of Castro. So, April of 1961, you have the Bay of Pigs invasion. Bay of Pigs invasion is something to notice because it is it shows up on the AP exam. Briefly, as you should know, Bay of Pigs is a little inlet here on the southern side of Cuba. Havana is the capital up here. The idea of it was to send a bunch of Cuban exiles. These are guys who had fled Cuba because they were Democrats with a small d sense. They were anti-communists. They felt betrayed by Castro. They were potentially going to be persecuted or executed by Castro, so they had fled to the United States. And you had a strong Cuban community here of Cuban exiles who were anti-Castro types. So the CIA got a bunch of those guys together. And the CIA itself, some of their guys, and these Cuban exiles, they formed this sort of miniature army. The idea that was that Kennedy didn't want to invade Cuba and trigger a war and trigger potentially war with the Soviet Union. So what he did was have Cubans themselves, so it's their own people, sort of reinvade their country. And they completely miscalculated. They thought that by doing this it would set off a popular revolution at home. All the people who hated Castro would see this invasion and rise up together and throw the bum out. And you could stage this kind of revolution and then install a real American-style democracy in Cuba. It was a ridiculous mess. This handful of CIA advised exiles made this landing. The entire operation was sort of screwed up and misplanned from the very first moment. They were surrounded by the whole Cuban army. They fought pretty. The Cuban exiles fought pretty tough, but they were defeated. I mean, and that was completely inevitable. And so the Bay of Pigs became this embarrassment, this fiasco, this disaster, this black spot on Kennedy's presidency. Whether you were strongly anti-communist, you looked at it and said, well, because Kennedy didn't go 100% behind it, and he didn't give them everything they needed, and he completely miscalculated it, he screwed it up. If you believe the United States shouldn't go to war, then it was the CIA sending spies and this army of Cuban right-wingers in this attempted coup that misunderstood that the Cuban people really loved Fidel. What it really did was make Kennedy again look like an idiot, make the CIA look incompetent, strengthen Castro's ties to the Soviet Union. He gets even stronger, and strengthens Castro's sort of arrogance because he had handily defeated these guys. That then leads you then to the next crisis, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now that Castro's ties with the Soviet Union were so strong, the Kennedy is brought one day photographs like these. October of 1962, U.S. was using things called U-2s. The U-2 was a spy plane. Well, I should show you one. This is a U-2. It has, you see the very large wings here. That's to give it lift to be able to fly at extremely high altitudes. And we were developing all kinds of military technology. The U-2 could fly very, very high, but it was equipped with special cameras that could take extremely detailed photographs. So in October of '62, photographs like these started being brought to Kennedy from U-2 flyovers of Cuba. And to you and to me it may look like nothing, but to experts at photographic analysis, they could see all of this business here. And it became clear to them that there were a whole ton of sites, 42 of them in fact, 42 sites in Cuba, where the Russians were building what could only be missile launching pads. All of the gear here and all the way the sites were laid out, and this is only one of dozens of photographs that were taken, it was clear the only things that these things could possibly be for were for ballistic missiles. So you're talking about at least 42 missile sites. Each missile that could be launched from this, at this point, technology had advanced, so the warhead, the nuclear bomb on the tip of the missile, was 20 or 30 times more powerful than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The missiles traveled fast enough that it could hit a city 2,000 miles away in under 5 minutes. So a missile launched from Cuba could hit a target 2,000 miles away in about 5 minutes. New York City is 1,306 miles from Havana. That's what terrified Kennedy and everybody else. If the Russians had been able to do this, if they had put these missiles there, they would have been able to hit any American city, effectively any American city, so quickly that there would have been no way for us to even warn people, much less respond in any way or whatever. Yeah, this really put things. This put the Cold War out of control. This is one of the ships. This is one of the ships, and I believe if I'm right about which photograph this is, these are actually pieces of the missile that are there. So this terrified everybody. So Kennedy is faced with what to do. So in October of 62, which is when this all becomes public, Kennedy publicly tells the Russians that he's blockading Cuba. He will not allow any ships to land, and that the Russians need to remove all of their equipment from Cuba and turn their ships around for home, or he would launch an invasion of Cuba and destroy what's there, and the United States and the Soviet Union would be at war. It took a week, and the world really, really did face the possibility of nuclear annihilation. It's a complicated story. There's plenty to look up about it. But at the end of the week, Russia backed down. Khrushchev removed the missiles, and the United States pledged that it would not invade Cuba. Now, what's to know about this? First of all, the whole event really terrified people in 62 with the bringing ever more home, bring ever more apparent how close the world is at any moment to nuclear war. And people really felt that this was it. And if you go back and look at the time, and there's plenty of material online, there were a lot of people really convinced that it was all over, that there was going to be a nuclear war and we were all going to die. The aftermath of it involved a strengthening of Castro's situation. The United States made a pledge to stay out of Cuba. So the net result for Castro really was that he didn't have to worry about any more Bay of Pigs invasions, and it kind of strengthened his hand. The net result for Kennedy was that he looked like it was a foreign policy triumph. He had faced the Russians eyeball to eyeball, and they were the chickens. They had backed down, and he had won. And the Russians had removed their missiles from Cuba, and that gave the United States a big boost in its self-confidence, and Kennedy a triumph. Khrushchev looked publicly like he had been the one to blink, like he had backed down. Now, important to realize, as historians, perception is its own reality. Everything I just said was the perception that the public had. So keep that in mind, and if you ever have to write an essay about it, recognize that that's what people thought and that's what they reacted to, because that's what carries you on then. Now we get to the historian's truth. It was discovered later that it was a more complicated thing than that. First of all, the Russians still kept some missiles in Cuba, and Kennedy knew that. Smaller tactical missiles, missiles that could not be used exactly against American cities, but nuclear missiles that could be used in case of invasion of Cuba were left there. Because they were not part of the negotiations and they were not part of the public revelations, Kennedy could allow them to stay without it becoming an issue with the public, and so Khrushchev got a little bit of what he wanted. And second, Kennedy had to pay off Khrushchev. The United States had missiles of its own in Turkey. Remember Turkey? We had missiles there pointed at the Soviet Union. And Turkey is, for all practical purposes, just as close to Russia as Cuba is to the United States. We also had missiles based in Italy. Kennedy secretly agreed to withdraw the missiles from Turkey and Italy in exchange for Russia withdrawing the missiles from Cuba. But none of that was made public at the time. So Khrushchev did get something out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though he suffered a public loss. But remember to keep that distinction in mind. If you talk in an essay about how, well, Kennedy got this, but he didn't get that, and so, the public would see it as no, the public didn't know about any of that. The public saw it as a Kennedy triumph. Okay. That's going to lead us into Vietnam, and we'll save that for the next video.